Good morning to everybody in the United States. Good afternoon to those joining us from Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and a welcome to all of you, no matter where you are. And thanks for joining us for today's seminar. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. One of our most important activities here at AICGS is to foster scholarship that brings together academic and policy communities in Germany and the United States. And for decades, the partnership we have with the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD by its German initials, is one of the most important things we do. We have hosted visiting fellows through the DAAD's support for many, many years. And last year, of course, these had to be conducted virtually during the pandemic. We are really pleased that these have resumed in person this year, and we're especially pleased today to offer the seminar, which will be conducted by Professor Martin Leiner, who has been a visiting fellow here at AICGS during the fall of 2021. He is here in Washington in person, but we are doing this engagement virtually to bring it to as wide a public as possible. And with my thanks to Martin for his work while he has been with us at AICGS, I am going to hand over the chairmanship of this session to Dr. Eric Langenbacher, who is the director of the Society, Culture, and Politics program at AICGS and a senior fellow here with us. Eric, take it away from here.
Thanks, Jeff. I'd also like to extend my greetings to everyone who is taking part today. And I'm really pleased to quickly introduce our speaker, who will be talking about Black Lives Matter, activism for reconciliation in a divided country. So we have our visiting research fellow, Martin Leiner, who normally is a professor for Protestant theology and ethics at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena in Eastern Germany. Since 2008, he has focused on transdisciplinary research on reconciliation processes worldwide, including historical examples such as German-French reconciliation, as well as Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation. So he's one of the founders of a new and very vibrant field called reconciliation studies, where the definitions, the research methods, the theories are still very much being made as we speak. He actually got a big grant from the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, which established the Jena Center for Reconciliation Studies that has 2 PhD programs and 20 PhD students. Dr. Leiner is also the founding president of the International Association for Reconciliation Studies, established just last year in 2020. And he has published extensively, as well as being the editor of a series of research in peace and reconciliation. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Professor Leiner. Let me just mention to our participants that after he's finished presenting, he has a few slides. We will move to a moderated question and answer section. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then I will collect, combine, and pose some questions to Dr. Leiner. Without further ado.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much for being present to this seminar. I'm very glad to be here at the Institute and to work here in Washington, and curious to know what you are thinking about the research I could make during the last months about Black Lives Matter. I have prepared a PowerPoint, which I would like to share now, and I hope everybody can see it well. If not, please manifest yourself. So here is PowerPoint. Now we should start it. Yes. The title is Black Lives Matter, Activism for Reconciliation in a Divided Society. Here, the table of content, the introduction will a bit show the perspective. Then Black Lives Matter, History and Shape of a New Social Movement. Give some information about this movement. Then I have a hypothesis for my presentation, which is also something inspired by Max Weber's theories. Then I give 2 examples, and in the end I will give an overview about the result of the first 10 interviews I could have, and make a conclusion for a case for transatlantic learning. So I'm speaking from the perspective of reconciliation studies. Here's our logo and also the link of our institute. As a PowerPoint will be shared afterwards, so you can also, and I'm invited to visit the institute if you are interested in this new research, which came up mainly in the 90s. And one reason is also that people realized that German reunification was only possible because there was such a policy of reconciliation Germany has adopted. And with this policy, it was possible also to gain the support of others, to countries like France or the UK to get the German unification. I must just stop the screen sharing because I'm afraid that the presentation has a problem because the slides are moving autonomously, and we must try to stop this. Maybe it's possible to work with this view also. This might be better for avoiding that the slides are moving. So then also it's a great example for relative success stories in South Africa, Northern Ireland, Rwanda, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. The first was in Chile in 2019, and the whole field of transitional justice brought up this vibrant field of reconciliation studies, but also the discovery of intractable conflicts that people discovered with the Oslo agreements for Israel-Palestine and Cyprus with the Annan Plan, with the peace process in Colombia, that you could make a good treaty or a relatively good treaty, but population might not join in. This means that there is also work to be done on population to convince them about a reconciliation process. And the last thing about reconciliation, just to give you a definition, the scholarly description, interpretation, and evaluation of processes of creating normal and, if possible, good relationships between states, groups, organizations, and individuals, reacting against past, present, or preventing future grave incidents such as wars, civil wars, genocides, atrocities, forced displacement, enslavement, dictatorship, oppression, colonialism, apartheid, other human rights violations, and injustices. Why normal and good is written into brackets, into quote marks. This means because normal we measure mainly by what the actors in the fields are saying. All the people say we have now normal relationships, so approximately the same as we have with other states, groups, or organizations, and we have with those which whom occurred these grave incidents. Then we speak about normal and good if people say they are good. So normal, for example, means that French people would say we have the same relationship to Germans as we have to Spain. And good, if the people say we have good relationship with, often occurs by Israeli state representatives who say we have good relationships to Germany, for example. So this is the definition with which we are working. And it means reconciliation is a multifaceted long-term process and requires transdisciplinary research to understand why those processes succeed or fail. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement, it started in August 2014 in Ferguson, not far from St. Louis. It's a movement which many people surprised that it started also in this place. And it's really different from the civil rights movements in the 60s, because there are different issues focused on as police violence against Black people. Then a hot topic is also the hyper-incarceration. Previously, they spoke about mass incarceration, but now with the sociologist Loïc Lacan, pupil from Bourdieu, they now speak more about hyper-incarceration, that many more Black people are in prison than white people. In the US are more than 2 million people in prison, just to remember this. Then there is the issue of increasing poverty. During the Obama presidency, the average income of Black Americans, or of those who have worked, fell by 10.9% to $33,500. White people fell by 3.6% to $58,000 average. There's also a lot of bureaucratic and legal violence still going on. Some speak about new Jim Crow, and also, for example, in voting laws. New topics come out like micro traumas. Then there is also a memory culture, the remembering of lynching, for example, and people speak of false success stories of racial reconciliation during the last years. There is also a different form of organization. There is not a great leader like Martin Luther King, but there are many activists in many places. A different generation. They say the old can join, but they cannot tell us what to do. Different culture, for example, in music, it's hip hop instead of spirituals. They have a problem with many Black faces in high places. So also Obama is quite often criticized by those movements, and they've found also new connections also with many white people who are active and put science, Black Lives Matters. Here in Washington, for example, in many of the gardens, you see them every fifth house approximately has this, buildings have this, but also an interesting connection is with Native Americans. This is also reflected by a new acronym, BIPOC, means not only POC or people of color, which was previously used, but means Black, Indigenous, or people of color, to underline that Black people and Indigenous, Native Americans or Hawaiians are especially discriminated and suffer from injustices. Other people of color would be immigrants from Latin America or India or other parts of the world who are also discriminated, but they underline those two groups. The goals of the Black Lives Matter is often the keywords are justice, reparation, memory, and reconciliation. And reconciliation, yes, it's a main term. Many people came out and talked about why don't we do like South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this is really a model for them. But in my interviews, I found also that the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the Native Canadians was also an example, is an inspiration, also because of those links with Native Americans. So, for example, when the Maryland Lynching Truth Commission is meeting, they are remembering arbitrarily as a first act before beginning the Native Americans who lived this land as a kind of ritual, and not a short memorial act, but a long talk about this. They owe the land to with them. Then the ways of communication, which was very strong also in indigenous people reconciliation processes, when they said buildings cannot be in a colonial style, music and dance are important. So in the Maryland Commission meeting, for example, there were singing and music also very present in the meetings. And you can watch them, by the way, also on the internet. And they have also common causes, and also Native Americans are talking about TRCs, for example, schooling of Native Americans in the US. Black Lives Matter and reconciliation. This is mostly a grassroots movement, and this is very innovative because South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Chile, and all the others around the world started from law or from state, or at least from some official body, but they mostly started grassroots and a bottom-up logic. Sometimes from municipalities, and sometimes also endorsed by states, so like in Maryland, for example. Reconciliation is a goal for almost all actors. Some start expressively Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so in Minneapolis, which is very much thought like the South African TRC. Others thought about Truth and Reconciliation, but thought we need first truth-telling in protected spaces. So in Ferguson, where people are talking about experiences with police violence, often in living rooms of people, because they are afraid that police or other people could step in and make problems with the discussions. And they have almost this idea of a sequence: first truth, then justice and reparation, and then reconciliation. And also trauma repair is a very important topic. This groups in Ferguson could meet. Black Lives Matter movement. Here you see a bit how much reconciliation is present. Here this is a poster from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Black Lives Matter, and you have history, rebellion, reconciliation in it. Or here you have an overview, a mapping of current truth and reconciliation initiatives in the US. The red ones, by this mapping made by people from George Mason University and the New England Law School in Boston, shows 28 current commissions across the country. These are the red points, and they show 5 commissions which already finished their work, are blue. And not pictures are nationwide initiatives like Black Women's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or proposed Black legislation, US Commission on Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, or the Legislation Commission study to develop reparation proposals for African American Act. So there are still a lot of things coming in the near future on this issue. And if you see so many things going on around the country, it really shows how huge this is. Here a poster from St. Louis, also showing Christian background in this development. There's also many pastors active. Or when this National Museum of African American History and Culture was made, it was a statement which is quoted very often as the place for healing and reconciliation, to show how much this is. Now to my special research here. So Max Weber, in his famous book, Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, he said there are confessional patterns in approaching social life, which are even active in people who are not very religious anymore. There's a more Protestant pattern approaching economy and more Catholic pattern, which makes the Protestants were more entering and co-creating the spirit of capitalism than Catholics. You know the thesis just takes this main idea to transfer it to reconciliation. So in reconciliation, there are also confessional patterns as well at work. So my hypothesis is the confession, so the religions dominate in Germany, Roman Catholics and Lutherans, the sacrament of penance and the confession of guilt by the perpetrator is a script for reconciliation, which very much also happened in German history. Of course, also for historical reasons why it was needed, but it also is a script the Germans have in mind. In the US, the confessional situation is more diverse. There are also the free churches, Reformed churches, communities and mentalities and revivals of the 19th century, and Jews important. And following the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew, and also the Mishnah, Yoma 6 to the Day of Atonement, there is a widespread view that forgiveness is made by the victims, and the victims forgive actively and seek reconciliation and take activism in this process. This led me to the hypothesis that in Germany, the script A is dominant, with Catholics and Lutherans, penance as a model. In the US, it's diverse. There are Roman Catholics and Lutherans, plus even more free churches and other groups, and they have the script B, victims start forgiveness and seek justice, and this is more represented in this sense of penance script. The test would be to find prominently the victim start forgiveness script in the US, especially in Baptist, Methodist, Reformed, and Jewish groups, and to find fewer examples of penance script and find them mainly in the Roman Catholic Lutheran environment. Just to say, what is a script? With a script, A is penance, means first comes repentance, contritio cordis in Latin, then you have to confess, then there comes the absolution, saying you are forgiven by the priest, and often alone in the church in the classical form, but it might be also by the victim who says, I forgive you, and then comes a phase of reparation, trying to show that I want to really make it serious and want to make it good. So this script of confession is strong on healing of perpetrators. If it is public, it provides public truth. It includes reparation, even if they come a bit late, which is often making the victims nervous. And also, the initiative is once again on the perpetrator's side. This is a problem, and the encounter with the victim is sometimes not necessary. Often the criticism of the victim is we were not enough included. The other script, to be absolute forgiveness, means the victims work through the trauma and they come out and say we have forgiveness and now we go ahead. And now I give you examples which are first, this script is strong on giving agency to the victim. This is also a result of social psychological research of Ari Nadler in Tel Aviv for reconciliation. That's one basic need for the victim's agency. And they can go public and lead to further processes. The problem is also to let go anger and revenge, but cooperation or trust, how do you realize it? How do you reach out to the perpetrator? So here's a bridge to the perpetrators. So we had in Georgetown University here in Washington a very important event in 2017. There's also a link to a video where you can see it, where they apologized for slavery in the 19th century and also for selling slaves in order to prevent bankruptcy. So this really impressive event. It was made by a Catholic university, and it started with anthropology of the sin of slavery. Then they made a whole liturgy of rememberings, contrition, and hope, with confessions of sins. Then a spokeswoman for the victims appears in this, can also see this in those videos. There are also several of the longer videos available, where she says, penance is important. We have come to give forgiveness. And then reparations were also decided later that a fund for reparations was accepted. As a reconciliation method, besides this fund for reparations, there were places renamed, and there was also something really decided that the descendants of the victims of the slaves have the same conditions to have easier access to study in Georgetown as have alumni and donors. Children. So this is the initiative, but typically for this model, it's a typical model A based on confession of guilt. This is a criticism that was also said by the spokesman of the victims. We were not integrated in the process from the beginning, and it was more feeling like Georgetown is reconciling with itself. This was a bit revised because now really reparations have started, but nevertheless, it's a typical problem of this model. Another is this Charleston church massacre, where the model was clearly in a church, Methodist church, that absolute forgiveness as an agency of the victims came very fast out, also pronounced to the perpetrator, 21-year-old man who had killed 6 people. And they said forgiveness is a part of Christian identity and we must free our heart from hate. They also said we do not want a death penalty, which was pronounced against the perpetrator and also repeated. And then they said he should prepare to, because God's judgment day will come to him earlier than he thinks. And they did, of course, also not give up justice claims. But the thing is, they could not reach out to the perpetrator, the typical problem. Because he still wrote in prison that he would do the same thing again and And also, we have the situation that justice claims were fulfilled right the last days. On October 28th, there was a trial which decided against the FBI that the victims will receive $88 million because the FBI did not make everything right and against according to the law in the control of weapons. So the perpetrator normally should not have been able to buy this weapon, and this was acknowledged as a mistake of the FBI. So it's not a compensation for the suffering, but it's because the FBI made a mistake. So those are examples who confirm somehow my hypothesis. So I wanted to go deeper and see into this interview. So far, I could speak with 10 persons. 4 were black, 6 were white, 4 were Roman Catholics, the other were Presbyterian, Baptist, Episcopalian, and Methodist. And they were, of course, they are far from being representative, but there are some experts from different social positions, like an activist in Ferguson, or a member of the TRC in Minneapolis, or an attorney general in Washington, I could speak, professor in Georgetown. Then a man who was 25 years in prison, social worker, psychologist in a hospital, black man in black hospital, or Baptist And the result was at least a beginning confirmation, I would say. Necessity of public confession of guilt was underlined by 60% of the interviewees, and 4 were Roman Catholics, so all the Roman Catholic sects, and 2 were Presbyterian, 3% of them. And the benefit of forgiveness was underlined by 40%. And there were very much mixed, but there were also a certain majority of Baptist, Presbyterian, and Episcopalian, and only 1 Roman Catholic. So this means there was a certain confirmation as well that experts see it also in this way. Justice and reparation and reconciliation were also underlined by all of them interviewees. Now, a conclusion: the US can learn, is my thesis, confession of guilt by government from the Germans. And the Black Americans are really so tired from being misrepresented and misleadingly attacked by white victims' stories, and they should understand this, because they are reported as there were riots and violence, and this was labeled as black anger, but not as a justice issue, and an issue for being protected against violence. Or when they wanted history is taught in school, that is labeled critical race theory by politicians, mainly Republican, and now also one in Virginia, the governor election. But this, they only wanted this is taught in school, slavery and all this history. When people answer to Black Lives Matter by All Lives Matter, they say, we do not understand. Of course, we are not against the lives of others, but our lives are not counting as much as others. We're speaking of colorblind, cancel culture. They see this as a sign that the white people are not understanding. Therefore, I think it would be good to have apology. This is also said by, within the same direction, we have Susan Neiman's book, Learning from the Germans, but she is mostly focusing on memory culture and not so much on public apologies. And reconciliation is not appearing. And so the policy recommendation for the US would be leading politicians, LFE, should come out with an apology and a confession of guilt for slavery, racism, structural violence, hyperincarceration, discrimination, and political violence. I think this would help a lot. And for Germany, also Germany could learn from America. German political activism for victims of discrimination and other injustices could learn from Black Lives Matter and regain agency by focusing on absolute forgiveness rules, justice, reparation, and reconciliation. Because in Germany, many activists are stuck if there is no confession of guilt. I live so often in East Front that they say, if nobody is apologizing, there can be no reconciliation. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm curious to the discussion.
Thanks, Martin. There is just so much that we can kind of delve into. But I'd like to go back to, by posing the first question, I'd like to go back to some of the initial things that you mentioned. You mentioned these famous truth and reconciliation processes in South Africa, Northern Ireland, Rwanda, and places like that. And you also said that the Black Lives Matter movement has been very inspired by the South African process, as well as to a lesser extent, the Canadian process with First Nations individuals there. But I'm wondering, well, I actually have some students who are working on this right now, so maybe that's why I'm thinking about this. but they're very critical towards the South African Truth and Reconciliation process, right? And that apparently there's almost like a second generation of commentary and criticism towards the South African process about how there was no real justice, right? That it was just talk, and yes, maybe the truth for the most part was told, or at least partially, but that more should have happened. So are there any weaknesses in the South African process that should make us kind of question its relevance for something as important as the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Though, especially in South Africa, although this criticism of the TRC and the reconciliation is strong, and so if you look into the effectiveness of the TRC, it was much more about truth and about social learning of the society. There were polls who showed that 70% of the white population said after this process that apartheid was a crime against humanity. It was a huge success of this process. The discourse changed. This is a point where the US is not yet, that people are so much aware about the injustice and the truth. However, there is a lot of economical injustice and a lot to be done in South Africa. It's really one of the most equal countries in the world, and not equal countries, but inequalities in this country. And this is a process which should be followed up. Reconciliation is a long-term process, and you cannot settle it in a 3 years commission work. And then another problem is the recommendation of the commission were not implemented in two crucial issues. One is the recommendation for reparations. There's not much done. And the second is that those who did not go to the commission were threatened that they could go to trial. And they had no chance for amnesty, but there were very few trials so far for those. So they went out very easily. The perpetrators of apartheid did not go to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So now some trials are starting again, but we are speaking about numbers you can count on the fingers of one hand.
You know, and also I want to get to your policy recommendations and some of the initial findings that have come out of kind of your interviews. You know, and again, I can't help but think about the German example as a kind of parallel. You know, I mean, there are slight differences of opinion amongst scholars on the processes in Germany, but suffice to say that as a societal process of reconciliation, it took decades after the end of the Nazi regime for there to be a sufficient societal consensus on, you know, the guilt, the shame, the responsibility for things that happened that Germans had perpetrated during World War II and the Holocaust. Do you think that it will take just as long in the United States? And because, you know, when I look, I mean, it's great that you know, everybody that you interviewed think that a public confession of guilt is essential, that they all want to work for justice and reconciliation. And your policy recommendation for the United States is that elites should recognize and apologize for the issues that are being discussed. But this is by no means something that is consensually accepted, even amongst elites in the United States, let alone the mass public. And I mean, there's even some evidence of some backlash towards a lot of the legitimate points that have been kind of raised. So how long do you foresee this process taking place in the United States? When do you think that America will be at a point where elites or society as a whole can actually start the real process, beginning with an apology?
Yes, I completely agree with you, Alex, that it's there's many opposition against this, and many wide pieces in the history memory and also in the perception of how the life of Black people is. So I think it should be prepared, also in media. For example, in Germany, if you see this process, it was prepared through even popular movies and presentation. It was prepared in schools by teaching that this change of the society happened. And, museums. Museums are now quite active. Also, for example, the Lynching Museum and this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I think there is a social change starting. There never have been also so many white people active in Black movement and supporting in the US than ever have been. In the young generation, many people said it's their hope that this will change. So it's true, it's difficult, but what gives me hope is, for example, also to look at Australia. Australia had this sorry day and had this public apology for the Aborigines. And maybe the US could also come to such a point. Even if Australia also has a hard struggle on all those kinds of issues.
All right, I mean, getting back to the German case for a second, I would add two more things, to our understanding of the German experience. The first is the importance of generational change and the important intervention of the so-called 68er generation to kind of lead to greater discussion and then eventually efforts at reconciliation. So I wonder if you see a parallel with the United States, that we will have to wait for the next kind of generation to really start to change things. And then the second thing, and this is something that I always remember from, our mutual friend and colleague, Lily Gardner Feldman's excellent work on reconciliation, which is there's obviously and importantly a moral and idealistic component to these processes, but there's also always an element of realpolitik involved, right? So the other thing about the German case is that there was a lot of pressure that was eventually placed on Germans, elites, and eventually mass publics from the outside to kind of encourage them to really work on the acknowledgement of the crimes and then the processes to kind of make amends. Do you think that the United States will need the same kind of external pressure to kind of really kickstart a comprehensive process?
Yeah, so I agree with you what you said about the German reconciliation process, and the next generation, I think, also gives hope for many people here that this might change, and external pressure on the US. I think it's very difficult to make pressure on the US from externally, but I think it could be from internal pressure that people increasingly will understand that it cannot go on like this.
So here we have a question from one of our other fellows, Thomas Fröhlich, who asks, do you think that there's a trade-off between material progress, for example, the Build Back Better legislation that's slowly working its way through Congress, and more humanitarian progress, for example, truth and reconciliation, with the assumption being that there's only limited political capital that can be used for kind of one or the other initiative? Or again, I can't help but think that there's another parallel. So I'm surely you've been following the German government's efforts to respond to the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in current day Namibia. It used to be German Southwest Africa. And I believe there has been a kind of an apology, maybe not the most perfectly worded apology, but something has been issued, but that the German government decided that there would be no reparations. They don't want to go there, but instead they would just increase aid substantially. And I think I see a bit of a parallel there. And what Thomas was kind of asking, that maybe one of the best ways to start to make amends for all of the problems in American history with Black folks is to actually pass legislation that will materially help them in their daily lives. So just some thoughts on that.
Yes, whether there is a trade-off or not, we will see how much budget is there for the issue of racial reconciliation or for humanitarian issues and building better and all these topics. So far, since the Reagan era, the development was that money was taken away from the social system and then spent on other issues. Maybe there could be also a certain payback, sort of. And also from reconciliation studies perspective, it's also important to listen to the needs of the people. And I think the articulated needs of the Black population is now are not only to have better houses or better social security, but also to have their history recognized, and their suffering and discrimination recognized, and to have less police violence, to have less people in prison, and so on, to have different conditions. And if you listen to this, I think you should never choose a trade-off logic and say we have only this budget and we can spend this and this for this. But you should enter the process and see where it's going. Maybe the US will have to spend more on this field and take funding away from other things, which I would also welcome partly. Several things, for example, military expenses could be a bit lower and things would still function not much different.
Here we have a question from another one of our visiting fellows, Michael Schwan, who would like you to elaborate a little bit more on the internal divisions within the BLM movement and how these divisions might prevent the movement from reaching out to a wider audience that would be likely quite necessary for forming a societal reconciliation coalition. And actually, let me kind of add on to that, because that was something I also wanted to kind of ask you on. I thought it was really fascinating the way that you contrasted the civil rights movement with the current Black Lives Matter movement, and how one big difference was a lack of leadership in the current BLM movement compared to Dr. King and, of course, many others back during the civil rights era. So do you think that that kind of unifying leadership is necessary to eventually gain success?
Yeah, those are very important questions. So I think it's also a strength not to have one leader. One argument is the leader cannot be killed because there are many leaders locally and it's a common process. This might seem a bit very pessimistic, but it's also a question of leadership in general. Yes, there should be more leadership, but I think locally a lot of leadership has been assumed by persons and, for example, by this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But to expand a bit more on the divisions now in this movement, so one typical division is between people who are had the idea to defund police, for example. Typical for after George Floyd in Minneapolis, that this was a main claim that the police should get less funding, or even some asked that the police should even not go in black quarters and so on. This is, for example, something which would not go easily with reconciliation, because it's not covering the needs of all the population, even in those quarters, because certain security is needed. So, also for Black people there. And to create a militia from black people that makes the danger of a civil war much higher. So there is some discussions are to be held, but they seem to me quite convincing that this cannot be the idea to defund completely police. Of course, the police should not be militarized and can make disarmament, but this would not be the issue. And other issues could come in also, like laws on weapons, for example, in the US. But again, the Australian example makes me hopeful that there could be also different legislation and a change of the Second Amendment someday. So there must be a lot of consultation process because it's also such a diverse movement. But if it's successful, I think something really creative, new, and important for this country and the whole world could come out of this process.
All right, and here's a question from Miriam Rose. She asks, maybe the difference between the US and Germany is also related to the different relationship between religion and the state, or churches in the state in the two countries. What do you think?
Yeah, the relationship is different, but I think so. The thesis I want to develop has, of course, also other possible factors to explain these differences. Also, the German history, I think, is also very important. That German history in the 20th century was a history that the Germans found themselves very much as perpetrators. But the relationship between state and church in the US blocks maybe a bit the state also to pronounce apologies. This could be the case. I always thought this is more because they are afraid of the voters voting against them, maybe also of legal consequences that they will have to pay much. Because in the US you pay also much more than in Germany. Reparations. Therefore, for example, in Namibia, Harrier went to American courts. It's a higher amount of money. So I'm not sure, but maybe I did not understand completely the direction.
Well, I mean, I think it's actually really interesting because, you know, there's obviously a much more institutionalized connection between the German state and the recognized churches or religious communities in Germany. Whereas in the United States, of course, we have the separation of church and state and very, very pluralistic and diverse kind of religious establishment. You know, I think it's kind of interesting. It kind of says to me that Black Lives Matter kind of mirrors the religious landscape in the United States in terms of being very pluralistic, very decentralized, with lots of kind of power nodes, so to say, whereas things are much more almost corporatist in Germany, with those kind of like peak organizations, the churches, you know, having that kind of hierarchical and collective power to decide things and then to kind of implement them. So it's interesting that there really seems to be a parallel between the religious landscape and reconciliation processes. And this is beyond the kind of theological kind of content of what different denominations or churches say. Can I just ask one more question, because we're very quickly running out of time. I thought it was really interesting that when you were talking about the American religious landscape, that you mentioned several denominations or creeds that were into this kind of second script that you put at the absolute forgiveness script, with the kind of agency coming from victims. And you mentioned Baptist reform, but also Jewish kind of voices in that model. So I'm wondering, is one of the differences between the German and the American landscape, and this is not to say that Jewish people haven't been involved, obviously, in the German processes, but in terms of influencing the content of the procedures and the mechanisms, it seems the Jewish voices have been more instrumental or foundational even in the American discourse. So, I mean, what do you think is the specific Jewish contribution to these understandings?
Yeah, for the Jewish, I thought for this also about this shooting in the Pittsburgh synagogue, where also the message came out, we on forgiveness, we are opposed to death penalty for the perpetrator, and so it's not so different from what happened in Charleston. And the Jewish contribution is clearly that when there is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, you can only receive forgiveness from God when you first reconcile with your neighbor. With those who may have wronged, and there is a discussion, who is my neighbor? Traditionally, it was often limited, but philosophers like Levinas, for example, say in the 20th century, should everybody you have to reconcile with before you can hope for reconciliation with God, and you should do it before the Yom Kippur is coming. So every year you should do this. So this is a traditional teaching in Judaism, and even if many Jewish people are secular, they have this in their mind that this is an important issue and something we have to prove, and we should take it in our hands and not wait for God's grace coming and apology from the other side comes. So I think they would be very powerful if they would be, these voices would be more present in the German discussion.
All right, well, thank you for that. We're coming up almost exactly on our time. So let me thank you on behalf of everybody here at AICGS for spending many weeks with us, engaging in this very important and interesting research. And we really hope to stay in contact and to continue our collaborations in the future. So thank you very much. And to all the people in the audience, we will have more research seminars with our other research fellows coming up in the next few weeks. So please stay tuned for that. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Eric and Jeff.